Theorize and be damned. 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 Damned.
Lý Lan Bing Bê Su Chô.
Theorize and Be Damned.
Theorize and Be Damned.
Theoretiseren und verdammt sein.
Theorize and Be Damned.
Theoretisieren und verdammt sein.
Theorize and be damned.
Leidenkeit hinausgeben.
Theorize and Be Damned.
Theorize and Be Damned.
Theorize and Be Damned.
Theorize and Be Damned.
Welcome back to Theorize and Be Damned, a podcast from Revol Press. If this is your first time joining us, you can find a little bit more about us as a publisher at revolpress.com. We are an author-run and oriented publisher dedicated to pushing the boundaries of left-wing theory. And we've just launched our newsletter on Substack. So if you want to support us, head over there to revolpress.substack.com. Join us there for essays, opinion, early access to episodes of Theorize and Be Damned, and exclusive writing from Revol authors. So that's the business part out of the way. Welcome to the show. Let me introduce you to today's guests. Hello, everyone. How are we doing?
Hey.
Good morning.
So who have we got today? So we have Terry Tapp, an artist and writer originally from Kentucky, now based in New York. Terry's work is rooted in his heritage in Central Appalachia, reflecting on politics and work, human evolution and possibility, insurrection and storytelling. He is the author of A Serf's Journal, the story of the United States' longest wildcat strike, which came out from Zero Books back in the day. Let's get to the correct tab for that. There's Terry's book. Very nice to have you on the show, Terry.
Thank you.
Thanks for
joining
us.
Nice to be here.
Yeah, excellent to meet you too. And we also have Adam Turl. Welcome back to the show, Adam. Artist and writer from Southern Illinois and an editor at Locust Review. They are a co-organizer of the Born Again Labour Museum with partner Tish Turl, and they are the author of the forthcoming Revol book, Gothic Capitalism, Art Evicted from Heaven and Earth, which should be coming up on the screen right about now. Having a few technicals today. But here comes the cover of Adam's book, which is very beautiful. I believe this is your own work as well, isn't it, Adam? The cover for the book as well.
Yeah, heavily plagiarizing Caspar David Friedrich, but yeah.
Beautiful. That's excellent. Well, welcome to the show, everybody. You already know myself and Mike Watson, hosts of Theorize and Be Damned. Mike is a theorist, critic, and philosopher, and the co-founder of Revol Press. I'm Bram Gieben, author of The Darkest Timeline and co-host of Theorize and Be Damned. So, Mike, everybody, what are we here to discuss today? It's a bit of a different episode.
Hey, yes, normally we have an author on, either an author we know or an author publishing with Revol Press, and we talk about their latest book. And of course, we can talk about Adam's book, which comes out now on May the 2nd. And should be available for pre-order from early March from the Revol Press website. But I thought we'd more generally talk about what's going on in America and bring on Terry as well, and have a kind of mix-up of art, politics, and activism, and what is to be done, so to speak, because people are awful worried about what's happening in America, but also what's frankly been happening in many places in the Western world since Brexit, really, and arguably since the dawn of Thatcherism, really, this kind of accelerated rightwards move that is now kind of migrated from neoconservatism, neoliberalism towards a populist right-wing format, which is kind of like neoliberalism with fascist characteristics, really. Or maybe neoliberalism with the mask torn off. I'm not quite sure. And I thought we'd bring in, because people are thinking about America, we'd bring on Americans, because, otherwise it's me and you harping on about America. And I want to know what it's like, to be American in America right now. So yeah, I really want to ask Adam how things are going, and Terry. So Adam, you co-wrote a brilliant editorial for your Locust Review publication, which you've just released online today, called Fascist Pizza, and it was co-written with your partner Tish Turl, who was also co-founder, co-editor of Locust Review, and Alex Bille, isn't it? Bille, who I guess he's a theorist. I don't know how he describes himself otherwise. And it describes the situation we're in. It uses humor, and it talks about artistic uses of humor and pastiche and abstraction in the 1930s fascist period in Germany. And yeah, I just thought it was very well written. It's like, it wasn't like channeling Benjamin. It was like, it's happening now. We can't anymore be talking about channeling Walter Benjamin and Adorno. Either we're doing it or we're not. And of course, doing it is not quite the same as back then, because it's kind of better in a way, because we have a much bigger kind of spread of people who can theorize. But this is a particularly good example, and I really thought it was inspiring somehow. So maybe you could start just telling us about this text.
Yeah, we Locust Review was for folks who don't know, was sort of founded really based on ideas from Mark Fisher and then Michel Louis. So counterposing Mark Fisher's concept of capitalist realism, the idea that under neoliberalism you can't imagine outside the logic of the market and so on, this sort of the future is dead sort of consensus from the ideological center, versus Michel Louis' idea of critical realism, trying to make counter imaginaries against that stultification of imagination. And so we wanted to think, like, what does it mean that the sort of negative space around capitalist realism wasn't in the end answered for millions of people by the left or by a new left, but by this revanchist far right with increasingly fascist characteristics, or what Richard Seymour calls disaster nationalism, which shares some things in common with neoliberalism, but also diverges from it. Initially, we called the editorial for the issue, and we're really behind on getting the issue out because we kept, partly because of life and everything, but also because of the shifting terrain. Initially, we're going to call it the call that's coming from inside the house, to cut against this liberal idea that Trumpism, the logic of it, was coming from outside the normal workings of the system, that it actually is a product of the system itself. But then after the election happened, that didn't really fit anymore. We joked, we were talking like, what do we do now? We're joking, well, the call's been answered and the fascist pizza has been delivered. So we sort of pivoted from that joke to go into what has actually happened. And there are a few things that I think are worthy of note. Obviously, this is building on decades of crises. And one of the things Seymour notes in Disaster Nationalism is there's sort of a deferred mythology around the crises that are happening, right? So we know, like, deindustrialization, the immiseration of the working class, the disasters that have happened in the Western United States because of climate change. We know these are all products of capitalism, class society, exploitation, and so on. We know the Black Lives Matter uprisings were because of systematic racism and things like that. But then there's an alternative mythology that explains these crises that then percolates throughout, particularly parts of the bourgeoisie, but also especially the middle class. Not to say there aren't working class people involved, that are false explanations, that have a lot in common with traditional fascism. But this stuff has matured a lot since 2016. So in addition to classic MAGA, reactionary populism, conspiracy theories, the formation of right-wing militias, and so on, you also, and this encoded anti-Semitism of globalists and things like that. Now we have Project 2025, the systematic plan to dismantle certain democratic aspects of the state, which gets complicated because of how the Trump administration is dealing with it. And then also the tech billionaires and oligarchs taking control over certain aspects of the government directly without congressional oversight or the rule of law, inspired by the Dark Enlightenment, quote unquote, philosopher Curtis Yarvin, the anti-democratic ideas there that believe the Enlightenment was a mistake, that democracy was a mistake, and this goes through billionaires like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. This idea that there needs to be a sort of CEO dictator or king to shadow the president in this anti-democratic fashion. And I think like what I want to like two things to before we hear what everybody else has to say. Disaster nationalism, like classical fascism, according to Seymour, provides a false explanation of crisis, but unlike classic fascism, has very little utopian promise, even for the chosen select group. There's the psychological wage in the Du Boisian sense, like W.G. Du Bois talks about the psychological wage that racism gives poor white workers. But it doesn't really promise butter, right? It doesn't promise bread and butter in a substantive sense, like racialized welfare was promised in the early stages of, Nazism and stuff like that. So, but it does promise blood to be taken out on targeted groups, particularly immigrants, queer people, trans people, possibly sections of the working class, Black people, Black politicians at the local level, the Kennedy Center of all things, in the which is a performing arts venue that President Kennedy set up in the 1960s. So it promises this sort of psychological payback that will cause real physical damage. And this stuff is all rooted in a lot of real crises. So Gaza, COVID-19, we've had the normalization of mass death. So it makes things very scary. And then pardoning the January 6th putschists makes the possibility of developing fascia much more likely. Fascia in the classic Italian sense of fascism of like armbands fusing with sections of the state. If you end up with a situation like in the Weimar courts where communists were punished to the full extent of the law after a street battle between the fascists and the communists, but the fascists were given a slap on the wrist or very little at all. And then trying to root that in actual practice. And I think this is what Mike got at. How do we connect up as leftists or as artists to the actual things on the ground? Which I think the priorities right now, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, but I think it's community defense, possibly anti-imperialism, and then class organization to try to provide an alternative to the fascist explanation for the crisis. And in terms of art, that means looking for inspiration from other historic anti-fascist artists, but connecting our work in real life to organizing. It doesn't necessarily mean the art hall has to be didactic in like a crude way, but physically in content and form and in practical solidarity ways connected to community defense, class organizing, and anti-imperialism.
That's fascinating that you mentioned Curtis Yarvin. This one's for Terry, because Terry's living in New York at the moment. So Curtis Yarvin has kind of come out of that sort of neo-reactionary dime square kind of arts and fashion movement. Is that something that you've been aware of in the past few years in New York? Are you quite surprised to see the influence of people like Yarvin reaching that far into the Trump administration, Terry?
I am. And I've begun to get my arms around what is happening, because I do refer to what is happening as fascism, which is the debate among people still. I think Ben Burgess doesn't call this fascism. He thinks that's unhelpful. But it's a very complex moment we're in. It doesn't look like classical fascism at all for a number of reasons. And I'm going to be heretical about this and say it presents a lot of possibility for leftists that we haven't had in 30 years. So I am surprised that someone calling himself Mold Bug and promoting a form of monarchy has that much influence. If you read anything he's written, it's not complete gibberish, but it's sophomoric, of course. I could say more about this, but not directly about Yarvin. I had a conversation with an artist very well-known artist in his 60s, late 60s, here in New York City the other day. And we were discussing what is happening. And he's, after condemning what was happening, and there's mass terror here with the ICE raids. I can say more about that too. But he said, you have to look at the fact that whether someone's a fascist or not, they are human beings. They need love. You need love. He said, I look at it like the Chinese and the Taiwanese. He said, they're very different people, but they need land. Don't you want land? He's Jewish. And he said, I don't want to put Israel down, but Israel needs land. Palestinians need land. We need to understand each other a little better. He said, I've been reading a lot about Hitler. And of course, I condemn what happened in Germany as a Jewish man. He's a Jewish American man. He said, but Hitler's main goal was to help working people, and that's what he said. I'm a socialist. I'm on the side of the workers. And he went on like this. And I realized, just to use him as a paradigmatic case, this country's been so crammed with contradicting mythological gibberish that most people can't figure out what's going on. They can't put an analysis to their daily events that's consistent. And like you were mentioning with that I think was disaster nationalism piece, what this is that's going on right now has no utopian vision at all. It has white supremacy. It has some elements of classic fascism, almost as a cosplay. It has elements of just venal greed, very American kind of greed too. It has this power theater going on. It's so many things are colliding at the same time that it's hard to put, like I said, my arms around anyone's arms around it. But it's definitely presenting opportunities for us. I've been doing a tremendous amount of union organizing and mainly consultation to folks organizing on the ground, which is massive here, and working with undocumented workers. I think what we could be doing constructively is thinking of what would a communism with no utopian vision be. When you had fascist movements in Italy and Germany, the classic Hollywood style, in the 30s and 20s, they had a vision of where you could get from this moment that was grand. Most people are on the edge of starvation or eviction. They're terrified. What they're looking for from Trump is an alleviation of that condition. What we have as leftists could be that too. It could be a hopeless utopianism. And I'm not trying to be merely a word gamer when I say that, but I think we could approach it in that way, and approach putting art back into people's lives in that way. I was reading Adam's piece on Gothic Marxism, and thinking of the problem, which is a perennial problem, at least in capitalism, that he presents. And that's the problem of what does an artist do, especially a revolutionary artist, against this wall of repression of art and alienation of art from society. Anyway, I'll hand it back to you. I can elaborate those. I'm sure you would. You have your own takes.
Mm. No, that's interesting, especially thinking of that in the light of the decoupling of art from the internet, which I'm starting to see happen a little bit. I think we've been producing content for the internet, and we've become kind of like quite dedicated to giving all of our content to the internet, even if it lives offline. If it's a gallery show, or it's photos of a punk show we've been at or promoted or whatever it is, that kind of like straight to internet pipeline, I think people are starting to decouple there. And that could also be fertile ground for, like you say, kind of bringing revolutionary art back into people's lives.
Right.
Yeah, I wonder what you think about that, Adam. Like, does that feed into what you were saying in your piece here, in terms of, do you think there are spaces being opened here at the same time as other things are being closed off?
Well, I think at one level there's probably going to have to be, since the tech oligarchs, at least in the United States, are at the moment on board with Trumpism more or less completely. So the algorithms are shifting, or will shift, or have already shifted in such a way to even further minimize both artistic self-expression as well as emancipatory politics and organizing. So we're going to have to do things we would have to anyway if we want to build successful communities, because one of the things that cuts against the far right fascism and disaster nationalism is a sense of mutualism, a sense of solidarity, and that has to be constructed in actual social contexts with actual social relationships with people around you, and some of that can be facilitated by technology and global media, and has to be, but it also has to be where we are. So if you look at the communities that have been devastated by neoliberalism, you look at like the Rust Belt in the United States, you look at certain parts of Great Britain that have been deindustrialized due to neoliberalism. One of the misreads of, for example, Brexit as well as Trumpism has been an exaggeration of class de-alignment or realignment, where it's assumed that working class, because these places were traditionally working class strongholds of organized labor and so on, that the working class was pro-Brexit or pro-Trump and so on. And when you actually get into the molecular numbers, it's not quite true. A lot of times it's the middle classes of those areas who have seen their relative position decline, their social position and their economic position do worse, who are looking to things like Brexit or Trump as a solution. And I think that this probably bears true in several of the examples around the world. If you look at the January 6th putschists in the United States, there were some working class and poor people there, but a lot of them were very middle class or upper middle class or downwardly mobile bourgeois, people who were wealthy but underwater in terms of debt, had seen a decline in their revenue, and they felt their position threatened. So what they are looking for is a protest for the erosion of their sense of social difference and superiority. They have resentment. And now that resentment could have gone in a left-wing direction if we had been able to, I'm not saying we would have organized those people, but some of the downwardly might have gone to the left, and some did, in things like the growth of DSA in the United States. I think the question, the way Alexander Billet, pronounced Billet because America, instead of Billet, because I know it's a French name, but anyway, he put in our editorial, maybe the question isn't, is it fascism or not, and where we can get into sort of hermeneutical arguments about like Trotsky said there has to be a failed revolution or the threat of one to have fascism, but we haven't had anything remotely like that in recent decades. Instead of saying, is it fascism or not, how much fascism, perhaps? Because fascism is also a process, right? It's not just the Nazis in power or Mussolini in power or Franco in power. There's also a process by which these things are formed. And I think that I believe there are openings and things that we need to do as leftists, as people who are part of the working class movement, as artists and so on. I'm worried to call them opportunities because of the enormity of the threat that faces people. And I would be also worried to think along the lines of the German KPD, like after them, our turn, and so on. One of the things that I think is different, and as we've all talked about so far, is the promise of a racialized or select group welfare that accompanied most traditional historic fascisms is largely absent from this moment. Now, of course, that was always a lie. Like the person that Terry was talking to in New York, the Nazis purged the true believers in racialized German welfare fairly early on in the process of their dictatorship. And certainly after the Night of the Long Knives, there was very little room for the people who actually believed the socialist quote unquote part of National Socialism. But that, and in that way, disaster nationalism or the current, whatever we want to call it, recapitulates capitalist realism and recapitulates neoliberalism, but only in that way in some ways, right? Like the direct rule of oligarchs is kind of counter to the way neoliberalism had been organized historically, because the idea was the state would be used to help in capital accumulation in this abstract sense. I believe this is a direct result of that, this sort of oligarchic interference. in the state, but it also contradicts it to some degree. But that means they're not going to really provide an answer. The scary question is to like the actual underlying reasons for these crises. The scarier question is, do they have to? Are we organized enough to force that to be a problem?
Can I, if I could add something to what you said, Adam, I don't want to cut you off, but for one, just to clarify, what I was saying, repeating that was said to me by the artist friend here in New York City was an example of the gobbledygook, the goulash, the mishmash that Americans have in their heads, basically. Like this, what you said is insane, and so misinformed as to be cartoonish. I do want to comment, really comment about what you were saying about who votes for Trump. I actually have a piece I'm writing on this called Death Wish Politics. And the reason I'm writing it is I come from Central Appalachia. It's Kentucky. It's in West Virginia. It's third world poverty, as the UN said in 2017. And it's outside of that, where it isn't third world poverty, it's desperation. It is actual poverty and people living on that edge. Most people who are poor in that area or in California or Washington State or wherever don't vote. And they're not Trump supporters or supporters of anyone. The people who voted for Trump are typically what we would call the petty bourgeoisie. They're those small business owners, basically, as you were saying. They're people who are struggling, but they come from some means. And I don't want to pull them out of a working class because they are, they don't own the means of production in a classic sense of being bourgeoisie, but they own some property outside of small towns, and they are diehard Trump supporters. What I've been involved with leftist groups since my teens. I'm in my 50s now. Most of these were and remain clubs. They're clubs generally for middle class white people. That's unfortunate. I'm not condemning them. This is just an observation. As I've been working with people, poor people, people of color, to help unionize, I noticed that there's incredible rage going on right now. And the rage can be directed anywhere. In fact, you can turn Latinos against against immigrants, brown-skinned immigrants from Latin-speaking countries or Latin American countries, very easily. You can also turn people toward these goals, as you were talking about in your piece. Are you going to vote right wing, or are you going to be a communist? That the trucker example you added in there. That's the hope that I'm talking about. It's not just that rage. It's the fact that anything that would alleviate some of the economic stress or suggest a spiritual answer. And I know that word sometimes is verboten, but the answer in art, in actually giving people an ability to dig their hands into the clay of meaning for their own lives, really gets people excited, and they'll devote their time to it. Part of the problem right now is we people in this country, speaking specifically, don't have any means to grab a hold of the controls of their lives. They have no parties they can align themselves with. They have no projects they can dive into and see that is actually moving toward a better life. There's nothing. So you have images of Trump, with six-pack abs and muscles, and that looks good to you because he beat up someone who sounds like the person who came from corporate to wag his finger at you and tell you you're a racist, which is insulting, but happens here quite a bit, and it isn't helpful with getting rid of racism. But so you want to pop that person in the face because you feel demeaned. That's very understandable. It doesn't do anything, and as you were alluding, it's just internet culture. But people don't have a way of actually, breaking ground on moving forward in their lives. And so it's just all cartoonish.
Yeah. Do you think, Mike, I mean, as people living outside of America, like in Britain this week, Starmer tried to echo the kind of Trumpish drill baby drill thing. I think he said build baby build. And that was just so pathetic to kind of echo that. Who's that playing to? But are there some risks about us trying to map what Adam and Terry are describing onto European/British politics?
Well, I mean, there is a line in the editorial I spoke of before, written by Adam Turl and Alexander Billet, where it says that I think the point is the point where the piece talks about the sound coming from inside the house. So there's a phone ring. They talk about a phone ring in the piece. It's like the phone is ringing from inside the house. You can't get away from it. So there's that realization that okay, we're in trouble. There's a ringing. Hang on, it's coming from inside the house. Now there's a knocking at the door. And what that device does is it shows that actually the future we're fearing is, like so often when you fear the future, it's actually the present. It's already here. That's why we're fearing it so much. And I think that's very true also because a lot of the things you're seeing in America already exist in places like Russia and many other totalitarian states, as Russia is effectively totalitarian. And some of the kind of political rhetoric exists already in Brexit historically, and in the Labour government now. Shockingly, that they just are carrying on the same rhetoric as the right-wing Tory government before them. Then we have this far-right government in Italy for a couple of years now, and we have Orban's government in Hungary, and I could go on and on. So it's not so much that is what's happening in America coming here. Is actually partly that what's happening in America is already here in parts of Europe. It's just everywhere, and we're not going to gain anything from saying that it happened here first, or I've been dealing with it longer than you. And of course, there are nuances because it differs in each country. So we have a very right-wing government in Finland. But I think that the new thing with America is you have this constellation of AI, existing social media, and Trump, and the fact that Trump seems to have these people in his pocket, or vice versa. So people are reacting to the potential of AI getting a hold of people's data, and then Trump saying he wants to identify and imprison, all of his enemies, which would be very Trumpian, a very Trumpian thing to say. And this all kind of fits for Trump's persona going back to his TV days, where he would just fire people, and he would always, try and punish his enemies, and he would always try and somehow triumph. And you can see him applying that logic very much now in the White House. But yeah, the implications are terrifying. If you think about AI, and then you think about drones, and you think about how AI and drones have been used in Gaza recently, and you kind of max that up to cover all of America, but then you have Musk also trying to influence elections in Europe, so this becomes a global thing. And I've been putting these pieces together in my head, and I've been thinking, am I just catastrophizing, and wondering, what is the most responsible thing to do? Because Adorno would have catastrophized for sure, but he was also against polarized, kind of shrill, over hysterical polarized politics, because he just thought that you end up in a situation where the two kind of opposing sides would end up playing off against each other, and the situation will become more and more aggressive, which is why he proposed that we make abstract art to try and just get out of the conflict, try and remove ourselves from the theatre of conflict. So I'm not really sure what to do, but I think, to your actual question, there might be a risk in taking elements of what's happening in America, of drawing a constellation that's very negative and assuming that it affects us here, because it might lead people to take themselves out of the picture, shall we say. It might lead people to act out of fear. I've forgotten what the phrase is that's going around recently. I'm sure Terry's written it at some point on social media, or maybe it was Trish Tell, but basically don't preempt the situation by removing yourself out of fear. You see what I mean? And you know, there's a globalized fear now at a situation that's happening in America, and a lot of it is just conjecture based on the pieces that we're seeing on the table. So you're going, well, there's a gun on the table that's unloaded, and there's a bullet on the table, and if I put those two things together, there's also a policeman, so the policeman's now going to load the gun and shoot me. Then, of course, actually, that would be a pretty good supposition. But it doesn't mean that that's what's going to happen, because the policeman might spend half an hour cleaning their gun and then go off and eat donuts, you know. So I think we have got to be a little bit careful about catastrophizing, particularly about countries we're not actually in. But at the same time, I think we have to be aware of the dangers, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, because we do all have concerns. Like, I wanted to bring up this piece you wrote for The Guardian about moving to Finland and then things changing politically. I mean, I've certainly got my own fears about the UK. You can see in the results right now that the appeal of reform is increasing. You can see people who are kind of rising stars in their bench who are actually much better at hiding the toxic ideas behind good, like well considered rhetoric. So what is going on in Finland at the moment? Is that kind of right wing shift underway where you're living now?
Yeah, well, there's been a right wing shift the last over 2 years since the government came in. Or I think it's around 2 years they've been in power. I mean, it's a government that is kind of centre right historically, the governing party, but their main coalition partner is a populist right party called the True Finns, or the Basic Finns. They weren't known as the Basic Finns, but they preferred True Finns, because I mean the literal translation into English was Basic Finns, but they kind of, I think they specified they preferred True Finns, yeah, they have this right-wing populist rhetoric, but like a lot of right-wing populist parties, they talk to a good talk regarding the working class and wanting to improve their conditions, have got into power and actually dropped all of that, but they've kept the racist rhetoric, but they basically become kind of accessories to the centre-right party's kind of rapid neoliberalization of Finnish society. And Finland has been known to be a kind of, how could you call it? It's kind of at the forefront of social welfare in the world. Okay, it's a standard bearer for social welfareism, and people look to Nordic region and say, you know, we should be like them. This was very much Bernie Sanders' reference and Jeremy Corbyn's reference point, and it still gets talked about like that, and it's frustrating because it's not like that, certainly in Finland anymore. They're cutting welfare very fast. They're cutting arts provisions. They're cutting, other kind of charity welfare provisions, and it's accelerating at an alarming rate. The only kind of positive thing is they probably can't stay in power because their ratings are so bad now. We'll probably get another government in a couple of years' time, but I don't really like to base too much on that kind of assumption, because when left-wing governments come in after huge cuts, they tend to stick with the spending plans and maybe kind of make things better here and there, but you don't get back the old system entirely. It's definitely a steady slide to the right here, and I mean I got a lot of flack for that article you just posted. Actually, there was a lot of kickback on social media and in the comments in newspapers, because actually a newspaper here reran the story in Finnish, and you could see just the polarization. There were actually quite a lot of positive comments, but there was a lot of the kind of like typical socialist doesn't want to work, typical socialist moves to another country and doesn't want to work. And this is aside from the fact that I work anyway and pay taxes. So yeah, there was a lot of aggression and people jumping in my email and people threatening me on social media and stuff. So maybe I should have expected that, but I could see very tangibly the reality of the populist politics here, that it's something that's really infused society, and it's very much in line with what we're seeing in the UK and in the US.
Yeah. If I can add something to this, I've been traveling and meeting with union organizers in other countries, so I have a little bit of a perspective outside of the US. In particular, I've been going back and forth to Europe and meeting with union organizers who are very grassroots and also anti-fascist. And I see in at least with the people with whom I've spoken, the same elements I'm seeing in the U.S. The basic two elements are rage and a complete lack of ability to do anything about it, which makes any sort of response symbolic. I was talking with workers in Germany and going over how unions in Germany are organized and things like this. The problem is, what the social democracy of Europe was a response to World War II to placate workers that were very militant. Communist workers, socialist workers. I mean, we know all this, and people who weren't even that political or politically well versed were nodding to me saying this, and they've also disarmed themselves. And I am very pro gun in this, so I'm not going to hide that. And I told them that these groups of workers, they were the only group that was doing anything that wasn't as despairing as the other groups. Was a group of workers in the Netherlands that help itinerant workers and undocumented workers, which would mainly be Romanian workers coming into the Netherlands. But that's the same set of characteristics as the problem in the U.S. Despair and rage coupled with an inability to do anything about it.
Yeah, no, that's very perceptive, I think. And you mentioned those ICE raids. I mean, that must be just a horrific thing to witness on the media. Are you seeing it take place like actually around you to people that you know as well?
Yeah, there are Instagram and TikTok accounts where you have people filming what's going on. One brave woman followed two men, and the men, unless you have a lot of experience with cops, you might not see them as cops immediately. But she followed them, and when one man turned around, inside his jacket was identification that he was ICE. But she got up to their faces and she asked them what they're doing. They basically brushed her away. They weren't violent with her, but she followed them and posted it. Like, this is very typical. The raids haven't drastically increased, but the cruelty and bravado of the agents has increased. So instead of just going in and raiding, a facility, you are getting this filmed. You're throwing people to the ground. Like, it's theater. But again, what can you do about it? There are things that we could do. I don't want to plug what I'm doing outside of art right now, but I've been talking, like I said, and giving consult to a lot of groups of people who are organizing. And one thing I try to impress upon people is we have lost our technical ability to wage class war. When I was in Europe at the end of 2023, I was meeting with an international group of folks, and they were proposing that they send a bunch of money to workers in Bangladesh and Myanmar. I said, of course I'm for this, but this is what you do when your friend has been beaten, and you dress their wounds. This is not class war. Our ancestors, as working people, knew how to wage class war. They didn't despair en masse like we do, because they had a way to advance as soldiers in a class war. I have definite proposals for that, which I won't bother you with anybody with on this podcast. But there are very definite things we could be doing. If you look at the literature of strikes, of sit downs, of what was actually being discussed between the lines, there are things they didn't talk about that are beginning to be discussed now. Choke point organizing. That was going on in the Russian Revolution. That was going on in France. It was going on in Germany. I mean, this is, turn of the last century, the 19th to 20th. We could be doing this again. I think it's really vital, since especially Americans are so, their heads are full of so much garbage purposely. It's the most propagandized culture that's probably ever existed. Not to talk about leftism, communism, socialism, anarchism, these words. And I purposely tell people, other than artist, the only ist that I sort of put on is aprismo, workerism, that I am 100% on the side of working people and on their side in the class war. But it's a war, and we need to return to ideas and techniques of how to wage it. I think that would be a game changer.
I think one of the difficulties is some of the things that we're doing or need to be doing are things that probably aren't best discussed, on a podcast, right? Because there's operational security and so on.
Yeah.
And the guarantees of the rule of law are in question in the United States. So things that might have been a minor offense might not be minor anymore. But when we talk about community defense, that means actual community defense, right? And that raises a lot of questions about what will we do if ICE comes for our neighbors and so on in a real IRL solidarity way, right? I do think that in terms of this question of there's both the experience of working class and also a lot of middle class people and the rage and this feeling that you can't do anything, which has been drilled into us in large part by neoliberalism, right? Like you can only tinker, you cannot really fundamentally change it. There's some universality to, or semi-universality to what's happening. I think it's a bit different in countries that are on the rise, like China, and so on, where there's a sense of optimism for the future because things have been getting better for some people for a while. Not that I'm pro-China or anything like that, but there's this attenuation of neoliberalism. They're this running out of things to privatize and profit from. There is climate disaster, which is feeding back into the economy itself as well as creating suffering. You have massive people being thrown off their insurance in places like Florida and California. So these overpriced properties that are no longer insurable and so on. And you have multiple crises born of climate change and the decline of U.S. imperialism in the context of this fragmented media and a decline in left parties in most of the West, with some exception, of course, in Latin America. And I think that, but the specifics of how this plays out depends on the local conditions. The politics and aesthetics of fascism is sort of contingent on the history and the social classes of the nations that make them, right? So think about racism. James Baldwin, the Black American intellectual, James Baldwin, could finally feel free in Paris. This is the same Paris that's systematically attacking Algerian youth, right? French Algerian youth in the 1960s, so much that they kill hundreds of Algerian youth by tying them to the banks of the River Sun. And then the high tide comes in. And I think that one of the reasons, things are also very uneven geographically within a large country like the United States. So I think in 2016, some comrades could miss Trumpism, where I was in St. Louis at the time, and everybody I knew who was paying political attention, unless they were ultra left, burn it all down or whatever, was either wanted Trump or Sanders. And that's why it was clear to my comrades and I in St. Louis, at the time, that once Sanders was pushed to the side, Bernie Sanders, it was probably going to be Trump, because things were so bad the center could not hold. I also think that this is, I do consider myself like a socialist. I'm friends with a lot of anarchists and stuff like that. But I do believe class organizing and the working class is the center of any successful far left politics. And one thing is and I say this is what I'd want to generalize, partly, is that you cannot rely on social democrats or liberals to stop this kind of thing. Like Mike said, if the social democrats get back in, they're going to keep a lot of the cuts that had happened. But we also see how ineffectual Starmer in the UK has been in countering the actual substance and then adopting the substance of the far right, how ineffectual or proactively enabling the Democratic Party has been for Trumpism in the United States. Biden adopting wholesale Trump's anti-immigrant policies, carrying out a genocide, normalizing all sorts of things that are going to be even worse. Which reminds me of the classic Hal Draper essay about voting lesser evil in Germany in the 1930s. People voted for the lesser evil, who then appointed Hitler to be chancellor. People voted for the lesser evil and got both. But the main thing is the balance of forces, and that means actual organizing on the groundwork, building class organizations, whether it's union organizing or tenants organizing, but also confronting the far right and defending targeted communities. And it would have been better if we had built more of that before Trump 2.0. And in a lot of places, we're playing catch up. And it's hard to generalize some of that because, again, we can't talk about all of it because we can't trust on we can no longer have complete faith in our right to assembly and free speech.
That's really fascinating because like what you're saying there is that while it might appear that some of the American left might go quiet in the next few months, it could be because they're in a way like hitting the mattresses for the war to come. And, you know, it's interesting what you said about kind of thinking about how to confront ICE if they turn up at your neighborhood. It struck me there's a recent, well, reasonably recent kind of version of how this might play out from Glasgow, where I live, the Kenmure Street protest. Basically, a large group of local people from across the political spectrums and across different communities mobilized to stop immigration enforcement from removing people who were residents of Kenmure Street. And that was a peaceful intervention. And I think, you know, from speaking to people who were involved in that on the day, they used tactics from quite old protest movements, like, you know, helping people to escape down side streets, blocking some other side streets so the cops couldn't get through. So that was a case of like using quite traditional methods to achieve that end of stopping them from taking people away in a van. So I guess, you know, we do have examples from the recent past of successful interventions like that. I guess the risk is in a country as armed up as America that, you know, things get real a lot faster.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but can I add something to what both of you said that I think we're missing? This has happened before. If you read street level discussions of what was going on with fighting brown shirts, with communists fighting brown shirts in Germany, or fighting black shirts in Italy, or even the foreign Foreign Legion and things here in the United States, the Legionnaires would do things like that. This has happened before, and people couldn't assume that if they were having a meeting that someone wasn't a police agent, that there wasn't someone above with a hole cleverly drilled through the ceiling or floor listening to them. This is very common. You know, what we're looking at ultimately, I feel safe saying this with our political orientation, is a seizure, a locking up of the system. I was in Krakow in 2021, and I saw an exhibition of photographs pre-World War One. The friend I was with, she noticed, as I did, almost telepathically, the same thing. There was something freer and better. Like, this is pre the ultimate locking up of capitalism that we're still dealing with, that precipitated World War One. This has happened before. It's different now. It's not, history isn't repeating itself. We're just dealing with the same things. And you can talk about, I have a series of podcast episodes that talk about techniques. And the way to talk about a technique without talking about a technique is to address an historical situation in which it has occurred and explain that in detail. Because if you're talking about how people ambushed a hill that looks just like the hill you want to ambush, that's explaining it. You know, when I was in Germany, people were talking about surveillance and cell phones, and there was an organizer from Paris who said that there were helicopters that had flown by where we were. I don't know if it's even true, but you have to do things that can be seen and heard and simultaneously not, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely does. And yeah, you're right. You know, if you can cite examples from history, then you're talking about the history, whether that's, you know, Kenmure Street or farther back, the Cable Street protests where they kicked the fascists out in London. We've got plenty of examples from British kind of socialist and anti-fascist organizing for sure.
Yeah. We can do this. This is the thing that, like, there's so much successful, small scale, unseen organizing happening right now. All over New York City, I bring up the same conversation with people when I go. I get a beer, or I get a cup of coffee, or I'm looking at a street seller with books. How's it going? How are sales? And this leads in how are people treating you? What are people saying? And it leads into a discussion of material conditions and social conditions as well. And then before long, you find that there's some boss, some owner of whatever establishment who is horribly mistreating the folks to whom you're speaking. Pull out a card and say, if you've ever thought of doing something about it, talk to me. It takes a few visits, but eventually people will call you and they'll say, what can we do? And you throw out a few options. Maybe you don't want a form of solid union. Maybe you want to act like a union. Maybe you want to take on some other tactic. I mean, there are all types of things to do, and we've been in this position where we've basically been at the point of total collapse from despair. Like, we can do this. I actually feel a little better right now just because there's so much rage. You know about Luigi Mangione. There are anyone on the street will clap about him. I tattoo in New York City, and when I talk to my tattoo clients, if I mention his name, about a third of them will immediately say, "You know what? In my house, his name is sacred. Don't say anything about him." And I'll laugh and say, "You're only preaching to the choir." But no one has had a problem with him. Everyone cheers him on. That should say something very vital right now.
Mike, yeah, sorry, do you want to come in?
Yeah. Well, I find that interesting. Well, I certainly observed that. Yeah, from Americans posting on social media, that was a crazy moment when that happened.
It's not
when
over.
Luigi shot. Yeah, sure. It's an ongoing situation.
And it's building.
That particular one shooting, killing of the CEO of the health insurance company, that it just went right around social media, all these positive statements and these positive memes reflecting on this guy Luigi. Is it Luigi Mangione? I forget.
Mangione, and they're being pulled from social media. I've seen yeah.
And I was just thinking, there's a lot of normal people, like you would call maybe normies, or whatever I mean, I wouldn't actually call them normies, but people who are not politically committed, people who are normally posting about fashion, or they're posting selfies, were posting these images of Luigi Mangione, and that was really interesting. And because people, I think, often are a little bit scared to post something overly political. Something of a killer, and then they just completely forgot that. They got swept away with the moment, but I'm not sure what that means exactly. And it runs up against an opposite tendency where people who are or were very political for a long time on social media and on their podcasts and what have you, have stopped being political around the same time. So what's given with one hand is taken away with the other, and of course they're kind of posting of a Luigi Mangione meme by somebody who's mostly posting selfies. It doesn't really it doesn't necessarily materialize as political action.
It tends to run along the lines of class in a micro division.
Yeah. Well, it was partly class, but I think some people will just, I don't know, there was some kind of Schadenfreude, and there was some kind of some aspect of him being, very photogenic as well, So I think that just came into it. But I think there's a definite other issue, this opposite issue of people who were very political and has now disappeared. And where have they gone? And people who were just years posting Bernie stuff, Sanders stuff, and then got very quiet, really around the summer last year. I know I've been banging on about this on social media a bit, and I've been talking to Adam about this in private chat. But it seemed when Project 25 became it became very public, people were looking into the implications of this, and a number of people kind of removed themselves from political commentary. And then you wonder, what were those people really about? But it doesn't really matter in a way, because it's like, well, if they're so lame that they, just because their man Bernie didn't win, they got kind of bored with it and they threw their toys out of their pram. It's literally like that. I can't have what I want. Well, fuck the whole thing. Then they're not really useful to a movement, which requires time anyhow. It requires time. Your guy loses, then you have to carry on. And we've all had our guy lose for decades. So I don't quite know Of course, it's just there's a number of people who were quite fickle, who saw in Bernie a real opportunity. He seemed to be a winner. He didn't win, so they tired of things. They tired of things quite quickly, and now that things might actually be dangerous, and they don't really have a horse in the race, so to speak, they've removed themselves. And some of the people, then their horse is so much in the race that they can do nothing but stay and bet on that horse and watch it win or lose or be shot or something. They horses that fall sometimes. So I don't know also whether this should be a judgment, because there are people who they've got so much in the game. It's not like they can now stand up and go, well, actually, I'm not left wing anymore, because that would ruin their stock anyway. That would ruin their image. So, it's not even necessarily them being particularly brave to carry on making the left wing statements, because they can't do anything else. And then there's people who haven't got their public image so much invested in the left wing, and then maybe for them it's logical that they remove themselves from that, because they weren't that anyway, and it's not going to really harm the image that much. Or people might even think, oh, it's a little bit odd. Why has that guy disappeared or stopped talking about politics? But they can countenance that. They can deal with that if it means they're not going to end up getting imprisoned by Trump at some future date. So I don't know to what degree it is really a moral issue. Always. Sometimes it's a lot more pragmatic on both sides.
Well, there's definitely some cowardly turtling going on among some folks, but I think it is also a number of things are funded in the U.S. in this very chaotic and weird way for a whole bunch of reasons. One, that we haven't ever had a real labor party. Two, that the Constitution only allows the federal government to fund things and do things in a particular manner. So a lot of things are grants that are then given to states or local governments or universities and then get applied. And so you have those things being cut off at the spigot by Trump and Musk. And you have a list of things that can't appear in academic research now, like things like queer or the word woman, or, you're not allowed to research it. So there's also people navigating some of these practical questions in some of these spaces. And then on the other side, do have people try to figure out what to do now, and then some going to the mattresses and in real life organizing happening. And I did want to say just a little bit about some of that concretely to the extent that I can. But I think that there's also the failure of the mainstream political solutions. People were desperate and looking for an alternative. The better people who are looking at me, they went towards Sanders and so on. I always had concerns and criticisms of that, but went towards Sanders. Sanders was decisively beaten by the Democratic establishment, much like what happened to Corbyn, but not quite as bad as that in the UK. And that meant there were no solutions on offer, right? The working class had no representation, even in a distorted way, in the election in the United States in 2024. So at least half the working class of all backgrounds and identities didn't vote because there was nothing to vote for. So I think that's left the left in the United States somewhat disoriented. They don't have a thing to point to. The social democratic left kept pointing at Sanders, and then Sanders capitulated to Biden. There was no primary because there was no democratic process to the Democratic Party in 2024. So that's part of, I think, the turtling also. But in terms of the grassroots stuff, I can just say a little bit about what the two main umbrella organizations doing stuff in the town I live in are the Southern Illinois Democratic Socialists of America, and then a group called the Carbondale Assembly for Radical Equity, CARE. And there's overlap between these two things, and there's CARE was founded mostly by anarchists and queer activists, and Southern Illinois DSA is mostly socialists with an orientation on social class. But the SIDSA has been involved in Palestine solidarity on a regular basis for the past year, part of regular demonstrations, trying to get the local city government to pass a resolution calling for a ceasefire for the entire duration of the genocide, building solidarity with the Muslim and Arab community in town, and things like that. Also is involved with the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which is a joint project of DSA and the UE, which is sort of a left union, one of the only unions that didn't purge itself under McCarthyism. I'm sure Terry knows more about the history of the UE than I do, to try to help people form new unions. Because there's really not, it's very difficult to form new unions in the United States. I've been part of union organizing drives, and a lot of the more bureaucratized unions have very little interest in putting in the resources needed to actually do a long-term minority union, meaning you don't have everybody in the workplace yet, campaign to build up the union, which is what it took to build the United Auto Workers and stuff like that. And SIDSA also is involved in other stuff. The CARE, the Carbondale Assembly for Radical Equity, one of the main things that we did when we started CARE, because I'm in both groups, although I'm not as active in CARE as I'd like to be right now because of work and everything, is we started this thing called Rainbow Refuge. So when they started making it illegal basically to be trans in certain states in the United States, we helped facilitate people moving to our relatively safe town, which is a quote unquote blue state, where there still are officially trans rights of some kind. So we would help raise money or help people find apartments or jobs and so on to help relocate people. And it's out of that committee that a lot of discussion about solidarity and community protection has arose. Was founded at, but is not officially part of, the Community Gay Rights Center in town, which has also played a lot of roles. We've also had new union organizing here, like with the Starbucks Workers Union, and that's also fed into the things around solidarity with women around losing abortion rights and stuff like that. But those grassroots connections, like in real life, are going to be key to building more working class solidarity to counter the right wing and the fascists. But also to do the defense. I think one of the things that has happened with some of the turtling online is that if you're not willing to take that step and be involved in the actuality of struggle and organizing, there's not a lot to say on those online spaces for some of these people.
Hey, can I, Adam? Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to add to what you're saying.
Sure.
The structure of our contemporary unions in the United States was explicitly created to prevent militant worker power. There are quotes about that. I can show you where to find them, but it was specifically put in that it was specifically crafted for that. The older types of unions or the other types of unions, industrial unionism, some of the trade unionism, networking. I hate to use words like council communism because people who don't like the word communism get upset about that. But this was a very basic way of organizing that increased worker strength. What we call business unions, the typical union in the United States, was created for the opposite. And very similarly, the German unions, they are there as worker management programs. In the Netherlands as well, I was working with a fellow who was having some problems with his union in the Netherlands. They are created to manage and dampen worker militancy. So I don't celebrate something like the National Labor Relations Board chair being shown the door by Trump. Yet at the same time, there's going through these channels is doom for us. Also, I hate to add this, but we really need to have workers of color, which is a term I don't like, but still it's understandable. Workers of color alongside white workers, and we need to have people who are very poor and struggling next to people who are high on the hog. This is the thing I've noticed over and over about these leftist groups. And it sounds like you've been involved with many of them, Adam. I've been involved with many of them. At least in New York City, they tend to be white clubs. DSA is not as white, and it's not as much of a club. They actually do good work in terms of pressuring for electoral campaigns, and that's vital, regardless of any condemnation of electoral politics. But there are people I've brought to meetings of the IWW here, meetings of other like less organized workers groups that are brown or black and speak in a different way, and they're ostracized. We've even had in the IWW, we had a fellow who's clearly upper crust in terms of socioeconomic status and young, saying some very racist things. And I mentioned this non-aggressively and apologized to the people who were offended, and nothing was done about it. And when I pressed it, he said he felt threatened by me. We have to have a way where we welcome and take responsibility for treatment of other people across these racial lines, across gender lines, and even across the class lines, microclass, middle class or lower middle class or poor. If once we are able to do that effectively, we're well on our way to addressing this situation and moving out of this terrible instant we're in.
It's been really great speaking to you today, guys, and kind of hearing about some of the practical things that folks are doing over there to resist fascism, to resist Trump, to resist the changes that are being made to American society. It's just great to speak to people who are grappling with this in a very practical way. Thank you for giving us your time today. Is there anything anyone wants to add? Mike, do you want to come in on any of that before we wrap up?
I think it'd be great to have just like one more kind of statement from Adam and Terry. Just how do you see things playing out? But I don't expect any forecasts. But more any words you can leave us with. What you think people need to know. Sorry, either of you can go ahead.
Oh, I'm not. I have nothing particularly important to add, other than, we didn't get to the other crucial question, which is what in the hell does an artist do about any of this? At least from my perspective.
Let's do it again. I mean, the thing is this hasn't. We haven't had enough time to scratch the surface. There's too much to go into, and then one doesn't want to be insensitive. And I didn't want to start kind of pouring on the Frankfurt School theory.
No, you could do that.
Another time we can get into the art stuff. It would be good to have these chats, more often. So yeah, please do come back individually or both of you. We'll have Adam back anyhow shortly. Many times I hope.
We didn't get to talk about Terry's book. I just read I haven't finished it yet, but Terry's book from 2017 is really good and gets at some of these dynamics about the problems in the American labor movement in a really great way. My forecast is to quote Tom Waits: "High tonight, low tomorrow." But I do think that the answer for art is related to some of the stuff we got at in terms of the left and organizing and the working classes in real life, actual stuff. And we can get into what that means. Obviously, there's a learning curve as we go forward, but I think it'll have a lot to do with making sure. I mean, art is a weird thing because it's both a social and a spiritual thing, right? So it's political and it's social, but it can't be reduced to that because it's also that's just all this other stuff. But I think it needs to be connected with that, with that sense of rage and despair, but also imagining against it in everyday life over the next period. But we'll figure out what that means in real time. And I agree. I think that's also the solution for that sense of a hostile left environment. You can't invite working class people to a meeting that reminds them of work. It needs to be the antidote to it. It needs to provide some sort of sense of spiritual and material sustenance against the stuff that's exploiting and oppressing them. I mean, I come from a relatively privileged, somewhat working. My mom was a teacher. My dad was a Baptist preacher. My partner, her dad worked in a feedlot. and went on strike many times. Well, my mom went on strike too, but her dad went on strike many times when they were a kid, and their dad, I should say. And they found a lot of left meetings even the better ones, very unamenable to somebody from a working class background.
Man.
Either too focused on theory abstracted from the actuality of life, or too focused on Robert's Rules of Order, or stuff like that. But that's a whole other conversation.
Can I add to that just to make your point again? Because people really need to hear what Adam just said. In so many of these leftist circles, you sound like working class cunts. And I mean, you sound like anti-working class cunts. I went to the IWW has me conducting these orientations because I have plenty of experience. I joined in 1998, and they want to issue an inclusion statement as the first thing you hear in their PowerPoint. So when you sit down to learn about the IWW you just joined, you're told what words are permissible, who you can speak to in what way. I threw this out because solidarity implies all this. Inclusivity and solidarity are joined. And I was resisted, thinking maybe I was anti-trans, which is ridiculous, or something like that. I was anti-corporate culture. And if you can't hear that, which some couldn't, it's because, as you said, Adam, you've come from a culture where you don't hear that. But other people do, and they resist it. Anyway, you made a very valid point. Sorry to interrupt on that.
Hey.
That's all super valid. So listen, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, guys. You can find lots more of Terry's beautiful artwork and links to find his book as well at terrytapp.com. I've been clicking around your website in the background here, Terry, and lots to read, lots to check out. So
I've been offline and negligent for like 3 years of turmoil here. I've been doing a lot underground, but I'll be putting more stuff up. So thank you.
Well, the artwork in particular is really, really beautiful. I like the kind of mixed media text and image stuff as well. You can also check out some details about Adam Turl's upcoming book, Gothic Capitalism, Art Evicted from Heaven and Earth, coming very, very soon from Revol Press. You'll find all of that at revolpress.com. And you can also check out Mike's latest book, Hungry Ghosts in the Machine, and my book, The Darkest Timeline. We've also got Tony Chamas, aka One Dime, coming up with a book very soon called Freedom to Change Nothing. We're excited to hear more from him at some point soon as well. Thanks for joining us on Theorize and Be Damned. Hope you'll come over and join us on Substack and sign up for more content, more essays from our writers, and lots more conversations like this one to come on Theorize and Be Damned. Thanks very much, folks.
Thank you.
Theorize and be damned. 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 Damned.
ลิลันบิงเบสุโจ
Theorize and Be Damned.
Theorize and be damned.
Theoretiseren und Verdammsinn.
Theorize and be damned.
Theoretisieren und Verdammsinn.
Theorize and be damned.
Reidankeit hinaussageru.
Theorize and Be Damned.
Theorize and be damned.
Theorize and Be Damned.
Theorize and Be Damned.